This is lecture 46 in the series, The ABCs of Communism, and the text for this material will be in chapter 63 of next year's book, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2017. Today is the 26th of July, 2016, and it's, if that doesn't strike a bell, it should, because this is Revolution Day in Cuba, the day that Fidel Castro and his brother and the other historic leaders of the Cuban Revolution led 200 young people and attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago, Cuba. And I noticed that Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is the party's choice to replace Raul Castro as president of Cuba and head of the party, is going to be leading the celebrations in Sancti Spiritu province. At any rate, I just wanted to mention that because it's when I was studying this business about Uruguay, getting ready for this particular lecture, which is the subject of today's lecture, The Empire Strikes Back Against Uruguay, I was reminded that when I was 15 years old, my friends and I had gotten used to spending that summer of that year going up to what's now the Sawtooth Wilderness area, and we'd spend a week at a time up there. My dad used to take us up there, or somebody's dad, and drop us off and then come back in a week and pick us up. And we didn't think anything about that at the time. That seemed like a normal kind of thing to do. And of course we were armed. We had rifles, and some of the guys had sidearms, and so we didn't have to worry about the bears or the mountain lions. And you could catch enough fish up there in a day to, well, in an hour actually, to take care of your food needs for the day. And of course we brought food with us too. This turns out to be important because later on, when Marshall Solomons wrote his book Stone Age Economics, and you may recall that we discussed some of this, one of the important things he brought out was that people at an advanced Paleolithic level of life find that they have most of their time to themselves, because it's pretty easy to earn a living when you have advanced technology of that kind. These were hunters and gatherers, of course, and I know that we could easily get enough food together in the wild in an hour or so to take care of us for the course of the day. And now, as time went on, this becomes an important question, because if you're going to answer the fundamental question of how society moved from primitive communism to the servitude epoch, you have to fundamentally answer simultaneously the question of why would people leave a system that had been doing them very well for millions of years. The proof of it is the constant biological evolution of the species, and it's spread around the world. Why would they leave that system for its complete opposite? And the answer lies that has to lie in understanding the mechanics of the negation in reality, and not in the manipulation of abstract concepts. And what we have in the primitive communist period is a general contradiction, which is that people can produce a great deal more than they do produce. And it has a general crisis in this system. Each of these different stages of the evolution of primitive communism has a general crisis which makes society move forward. It's the general engine of that. Until we get to a point at which the whole point of not producing more than what you need on a day-to-day basis for each member of your group, that you have been developing to the point at which you really only need to spend a small part of each day doing your hunting, gathering, and that the follow-up is that what you have done is to create a great deal of spare time that you spend studying everything around you, and that while you're doing all of this, learning all these things about the environment, you are setting up a new bank of information which will make the eventual release of surplus social product in large amounts, far more than you need, inevitable. And this is how this idea of negation of the negation should be understood in practice. And it came to me much easier to understand than it did to one of the most intelligent men I've ever known in my life, named Antonio Gilman, who said he couldn't imagine trying to live out in the woods and without spending all of his time doing it. And I thought, at the time, although I kept my thought to myself, what that reflects is the fact that as intelligent as Antonio is, he led a very sheltered life. His father was a professor of Spanish literature, tenured at Harvard, and he grew up in that kind of an atmosphere. Never spent any time working out in the woods the way we did, as a matter of course. And it's these kinds of experiences which help you understand what Stone Age people were going through. Now, these are some of the thoughts that came to my mind when I started with this discussion, with this writing of this chapter on Uruguay, because we have some of the earliest dates on human occupation of the New World just north of the Uruguayan border, around 70,000 years ago. And just from what we could see in these particular sites, for what we've seen in the archaeological reports, these people were very much in command of their environment. They were spending more and more time doing things other than pursuing hunting and gathering or collecting of wild resources. These were true broad-spectrum exploiters. Well, at any rate, within Uruguay proper, the oldest sites are only about 10,000 years, so that's, but at any rate, we should mention that we know we have 10,000-year-old sites in Uruguay proper, and of course by this time people had become far more than just hunters and gatherers. They were proto-archaic and archaic. We know that these archaeological sites are the early remnants of people that led to the ethnographic Catalanense and Guarani cultures of Uruguay and neighboring Brazil. In fact, the earliest bolas in Uruguay we have found they're about 7,000 years old. There's ancient rock art at a place called Chamanga, where 4,000 years ago the Chirua and Guarani people lived. And in general, in Holocene times, that is after the end of the last ice age, Uruguayan territory was inhabited by small tribes of nomadic Chirua, Chana, Arakan, and Guarani peoples who were broad-spectrum wild resource exploiters developing agriculture, and they may have numbered about 20,000 people. Indigenous peoples, however, had almost disappeared by the time of independence of Uruguay because of European diseases and, most importantly, constant European genocide. This onslaught against Native America culminated on April 11th in 1831 with the Masacre de Salsipuedes, or the Massacre of Salsipuedes. Most of the Chara men were killed by Uruguayan army orders on the orders of President Fructuoso Rivera, and the remaining 300 Chirua women and children were sold into slavery as household servants for their European conquerors. Consequently, the indigenous peoples in Uruguay, or the native Uruguayans, are essentially extinct, having disappeared in the 1830s. We have some ethnographic knowledge about the Guarani. The Chirua were probably the most encountered indigenous people of this southern cone in what was known as Banda Oriental. They were all seasonally moving people who practiced typical proto-archaic and archaic exploitation and eventually formative agriculture. We have discussed, of course, all those stages in earlier lectures. I won't go over it again. Other tribes were the Minuane, the Yaro, Guanoa, Chana, Bohan, Arakan, and the languages once spoken in this area include Chirua, Chana, Bueno, and Guarani. Well, nowadays, a minor percentage of Uruguayans have indigenous descent. According to the 2011 census, 2.4% of the population reported having some indigenous ancestry. Now, during the colonial era, the present-day territory of Uruguay was known as Banda Oriental, or the east bank of the river Uruguay. that it was a buffer territory between Portuguese Brazil and Spanish Argentina and Paraguay. The Portuguese first explored the region of present-day Uruguay in 1512 to 1513 when Juan Diaz de Solis landed and was killed and eaten by natives. And Ferdinand Magellan anchored at the future site of Montevideo in 1520. Sebastian Cabot explored the Rio de la Plata in 1526. But the lack of gold and silver limited settlement of the region during the 1500s and 1600s, so it was not until the 1700s that a permanent settlement was created in what is today Montevideo. And not until the 1830s did the Spanish interlopers manage to exterminate the last of the Native American population, as we've just discussed. Now, in 1603, cattle and horses were introduced into Uruguay by Hernando Arias de Saavedra, and by 1650, large herds of both of these have been produced, cattle and horses, that is. Spanish Jesuit priests founded the first permanent settlement on the territory of present-day Uruguay. They created the Misiones Orientales in the territory of the Chorus in 1624 and Villa Soriano on the Rio Negro. The idea was to bring these indigenous people into Spanish feudalism as slaves and serfs. Portuguese colonists in 1680 established Colonia do Sacramento on the northern bank of the La Plata River on the opposite coast of Buenos Aires. Spain then sought to limit Portugal's expansion from Brazil's frontiers, and in 1726 the Spanish established San Felipe de Montevideo, also on the northern bank of the La Plata River. The natural harbor there developed as a commercial center competing with Buenos Aires. Spain then captured Colonia del Sacramento, but the Portuguese had set up. And the Treaty of Madrid between Spain and Portugal secured Spanish control over Banda Oriental, and wealthy white Spaniards were given land. In 1776, while the North Americans were fighting for independence from their colonial master Great Britain, Spain's viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was established with its capital in Buenos Aires. The viceroyalty included the territory of Uruguay. At this time, Uruguay was owned by an oligarchy of cattle ranchers and worked by black slaves and small white farmers. However, bourgeois elements had created a city in Montevideo, and by 1800, more than 10,000 people lived there, and another 20,000 people had spread into the rest of the province, and about 30% of these numbers in both cases were African slaves. In the early 1800s, there was ongoing war between the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and their colonial forces for the La Plata Basin. And from 1796 until 1808 and 1807, Spain and Britain were at war. In 1806, the Brits invaded Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Then in 1807, the Brits doubled down and occupied Montevideo with a 10,000-man army. The British gave up their attacks in Argentina and Uruguay when Iberia's Peninsular War turned Britain and Spain into allies against Napoleon. Now, the struggle for independence from 1811 to 1828, and we'll begin with the provincial freedom under Artigas. The May Revolution of 1810 in Buenos Aires marked the end of Spanish rule. The viceroyalty dissolved and the local ruling class established the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. The home rule that they had long sought, they had finally achieved. However, as in North America, there were many unreconstructed royalists in Montevideo, so there was ongoing civil war between them and the revolutionaries who supported the independence from Spain. Thus the war between Buenos Aires and the recalcitrant Spaniards. Local patriots under José Gervasio Artigas issued proclamation of 26 February 1811 that called for war against Spanish rule. With help from Buenos Aires, Artigas defeated Royalist Spaniards on May 18, 1811 at the Battle of Las Piedras. Then began the siege of Montevideo. At this point, the Spanish victory invited Portuguese from Brazil, the Spanish viceroy, I should say, he invited the Portuguese from Brazil to launch a military invasion of Banda Oriental. Afraid to lose this province to the Portuguese, Buenos Aires made peace with the Spanish viceroy. British pressure persuaded the Portuguese to withdraw in late 1811, leaving royalists in control of Montevideo. Angered by this betrayal from Buenos Aires, Artigas, with some 4,000 supporters, retreated to Entre Rios province. That's the next biggest province to Buenos Aires in Argentina. During the second Banda Oriental campaign in 1813, Artigas joined José Rondeau's army from Buenos Aires and started the second siege of Montevideo. Now, Uruguay was set for independence when Artigas created the League of the Free People as his Sons of Liberty, which soon became known in short as the Federal League, or Liga Federal. The League declared that it would unite the Banda Oriental provinces that wanted to be free from Buenos Aires. Accordingly, he denounced the Congress of Tucumán. Artigas gave himself the title Protector of the League, kind of like, you'll recall that Cromwell gave himself the title of Protector of the English Republic, as opposed to being king. His political philosophy became known as Artigism. He had included a land reform that would bring white small farmers into his revolutionary forces. Now, the rapid growth of the Liga Federal frightened the Portuguese government. Of course, the Portuguese crown hated the republicanism of the League. They knew it would spread the idea of home rule to their adjoining colony of Brazil. In August 1816, forces from Brazil invaded Uruguay, intending to hang Artigas and strangle his revolution in the cradle. Portuguese royal forces included a fully armed force of disciplined Portuguese European veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, as well as conscripted Brazilian troops, and they occupied Montevideo on January 20th of 1817, and in 1820 Artigas' forces were defeated in the Battle of Taquarembó. For the moment, Banda Oriental would be incorporated into Brazil as the Cisplatina province. During the War of Independence of Brazil in 1823-24, there was the third siege of Montevideo. Now, the Spanish Home Rule forces occupied Uruguay on April 19, 1925, from Buenos Aires. These were the so-called 33 Orientals, led by one Antonio Lavallea, who landed in Cisplatina. They reached Montevideo on May 20th of 1825, that is, just about a month later, and on June 14th in La Florida they formed a provisional government, and on August 25th they selected a provincial assembly and declared the secession of Cisplatina province from the Empire of Brazil. Simultaneously they declared allegiance to the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, and in response Brazil launched the Cisplatine War against them and the Independence Revolutionary Government in Buenos Aires. This war ended in 1828 with the Treaty of Montevideo. Brazil and Argentina agreed to recognize an independent Uruguay as a buffer state between them. The Paraguayan War secured Uruguayan independence, and Uruguay's Constitution of 1830 governed the country thereafter. Now, as for the class structure of early Uruguay, the ruling classes of Uruguay followed those of the rest of the capitalist world of that time and divided into two parties. One represented the wealthiest latifundista oligarchs. These were the blancos, or whites, and headed by a man named Manuel Uribe. He looked after the agricultural interests of big farmers and ranchers and promoted protectionism, meaning high tariffs on imported agricultural commodities. The other party were the Colorados, or the Reds, and they also represented wealthy landed oligarchs, but among these were Colorados led by Fructuoso Rivera, and they represented wealthy landed oligarchs in cap business in Montevideo. In other words, these latifundistas in origin of the Colorado type had equally strong interests in the trade of commodities as they did in their agricultural holdings, especially those true commodities born of the capitalist system itself, those produced by the appropriation of unpaid labor time, in other words. Thus we have the respective origins of the conservative blancos, or whites, and the liberal Colorados, or Reds, parties. You will note that the working class had come into existence in Montevideo, but that it had no political party of its own and no place in the governance of the nation. And also that although the petty bourgeois small-cap farmers existed in the countryside, for the most part they supported their Blanco betters. Those small white farmers that lived close to Montevideo and took day jobs in factories when they could get them would support their Colorado betters, the factory owners, if they were called upon to vote or demonstrate. And these are the historical foundations of these two political parties that would rule Uruguay for 100 years. Now, both parties took their informal names from the color of their armbands, red or white, that their supporters wore. And that's all it meant. So the idea of red, as it would become to be known as communism, has nothing to do with this. These parties had correspondent warring political factions in neighboring Argentina. The Colorados, under Uruguay's first president, Fructuoso Rivera, favored the exiled Argentinian liberal unitarios, many of whom had taken refuge in Montevideo. The Blancos were led by Uruguay's second president, Manuel Uribe, who was a close associate of the Argentine strongman Juan Manuel de Rosas. Okay, now, between 1839 and 1852, Uruguay experienced what was called the Guerra Grande, or the Great War. Uribe took Rosas' side when the French Navy blockaded Buenos Aires in 1838. This led the Colorados and the exiled Unitarios to seek French backing against Uribe. On June 15th of 1838, an army led by the Colorado leader Rivera overthrew Uribe, who fled to Argentina. The Argentinian Unitarios then formed a government in exile in Montevideo, and with French encouragement, Rivera declared war on Rosas in 1839. And that conflict would last 13 years, and as I say, became known as the Guerra Grande, or the Great War. In 1840, an army of exiled Unitarios attempted to invade northern Argentina from Uruguay and fucked that up. In 1842, Argentinian army overran Uruguay on Uribe's behalf, and they seized most of the country but failed to take the capital of Montevideo. So the Great Siege of Montevideo began then in February of 1843, and it lasted for 9 years. The besieged Uruguayans called on resident foreigners for help, and they got it from France and Italy. The Italian Legion and the Uruguayan Navy were led by the exiled Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had been supporting himself in exile, teaching mathematics in Montevideo. Now, during this siege, Uruguay had two parallel governments. The first was called the Gobierno de la Defensa. It was in Montevideo, and it was led by Joaquin Suarez, and it lasted between 1843 and 1852. And the second was called the Gobierno del Cerrito, which was headquartered at Cerrito de la Victoria and ruled the rest of the country, and led by Manuel Uribe, also 1843, but this time to 1851, 1 year difference. So throughout this period, there were two governments running the country. The Argentinian blockade of Montevideo was half-hearted. Rosas' interests were commercial, and he did not want to upset business in international shipping on the River Plate. However, in 1845, when access to Paraguay was blocked, Britain and France allied against Rosas, seizing his fleet. They then began a blockade of Buenos Aires. Simultaneously, Brazil joined in war against Argentina. Rosas reached peace deals with Great Britain and France in 1849 and 1850, respectively. The French agreed to withdraw their legion if Rosas evacuated Argentinian troops from Uruguay. Uribe still maintained a loose siege of the capital. In 1851, the Argentinian provincial strongman Justo José de Urquiza turned against Rosas and signed a pact with the exiled Unitarios, the Uruguayan Colorados, and Brazil against him. Urquiza then crossed into Uruguay, defeated Uribe, and lifted the siege of Montevideo. He then overthrew Rosas at the Battle of Caseros in 1852, and with Rosas' defeat and exile, the Great War, La Guerra Grande, finally ended. Uruguay then officially abolished slavery in 1852, something that Brazil wouldn't do for another 30 years. A ruling triumvirate consisting of Rivera, Lavallejo and Venancio Flores was established then in 1852. However, Lavallejo died in 1853. Rivera died in 1854. The remaining dictator, Venancio Flores, was overthrown in 1855, and that was the end of an era. The government of Montevideo rewarded Brazil's financial and military support by signing the 5 treaties in 1851. In other words, they won, but they won because of Brazil's help, and now they were going to have to pay the price. These called for perpetual alliance between the two countries, and Montevideo confirmed Brazil's right to intervene in Uruguay's internal affairs as it saw fit. Uruguay also renounced its territorial claims north of the Rio Guarem, and so this reduced Uruguay's size to about 176,000 square kilometers, making it the smallest, almost the smallest country in South America. Uruguay also ceded sovereignty to Brazil on its northern border, giving exclusive right of navigation in the Laguna Marin and the Rio Jaguaron to that nation, and these bodies of water were anyway the natural borders between the two countries, so it was no great loss to Uruguay, except perhaps the prestige of border control. On the other hand, in accordance with the 1851 treaties, Brazil intervened militarily in Uruguay as often as it wanted to, as often as it deemed necessary. So, from 1864 to 65, there is what's called the Uruguayan War, fought between the governing Blancos and Alliance of Empire of Brazil against the Colorados, supported by Argentina. In 1863, the Colorado leader Venancio Flores launched the liberating crusade aimed at toppling President Bernardo Berro and his Colorado Blanco coalition, the fusionist government, and Flores was aided by Argentina's President Bartolomé Mitre. We've discussed all these guys before when we discussed Argentina and Brazil, but I'm not going to go over that. If you care, you can read it in the book. The fusionist coalition collapsed as Colorados joined Flores' ranks. The Uruguayan Civil War developed into a crisis of international scope that destabilized the entire region, and even before the Colorado Rebellion, the Blancos had sought an alliance with Paraguayan dictator Francisco Solano Lopez. Berro's now purely Blanco government also received support from Argentine Federalists, who opposed Mitre and his Unitarians, switching from English to Spanish, switches the pronunciation. But at any rate, the situation deteriorated as the Empire of Brazil was drawn into the conflict. Brazil decided to intervene to reestablish the security of its southern frontiers and its influence in regional affairs. In a combined offensive against Blanco strongholds, the Brazilian Colorado troops advanced through Uruguayan territory, eventually surrounding Montevideo, and faced with certain defeat. The Blanco government capitulated on 20 February 1865, almost the same time as the Confederacy was defeated in North America. Treaty of the Triple Alliance in 1865. The Emperor of Brazil, the President of Argentina, and the Colorado General Venancio Flores, who was the Uruguayan head of government, whom the former two had helped to gain power, created an alliance. This was called the Triple Alliance, and its purpose was to wage a war against the Paraguayan leader, Francisco Solano Lopez. The resulting Paraguayan War ended with the invasion of Paraguay and its defeat by the armies of the three countries. The war brought prosperity, however, to the capital of Montevideo, which was used as a supply station by the Brazilian Navy, and this, of course, gave them the final upper hand in terms of their own internal class struggle within Uruguay. The short-lived war would have been regarded as an outstanding success for Brazilian and Argentine interests had Paraguayan intervention in support of the Blancos, with attacks upon Brazilian and Argentine provinces, not led to the long and costly Paraguayan War. You know, we discussed that before, especially around Argentina, and we'll discuss it again in the next lecture about Paraguay. But generally, scholars see this Paraguayan War as the bloodiest war in the history of South America. And, as I say, it could have been a success for Brazilian and Argentine interests in support of the Blancos. but it really wasn't because it took so long and it cost so much. In February 1868, former presidents Bernardo Berro and Venancio Flores were both assassinated. Now, there was therefore a century of Colorado rule to follow up, and the Colorados ruled without interruption from 1865 until 1958. Despite internal and external wars, political and economic fluctuation, the big capitalists of Montevideo held on to power because they always had the cash to pay the thuggery. One reason for their prosperity was the autochthonous capitalist industrial revolution, with labor supplied by waves of mass immigration from Europe. Now, this period of Colorado rule began with the 1872 Power Sharing Agreement, after the government of General Lorenzo Valle y Grau suppressed the Revolution of the Lances. Now, this is a name you want to remember, this guy Valle. He's probably the most important person at the end of the last century and the beginning of the next one. Power sharing started in September 1872 under Blanco's leader Timoteo Aparicio. A peace agreement was signed on April 6, 1872, and this power sharing agreement and peace treaty gave Blancos control over 4 of the 13 departments, which are of Uruguay. That's what they call their provinces, namely Canelones, San Jose, Florida, and Cerro Largo. That's it. So a guaranteed, if limited, representation in Parliament went along with it. This establishment of the policy of co-participation represented the search for a new formula of compromise based on the peaceful coexistence of the party in power and the party in opposition. They were both capitalist parties, after all, and both had solid bourgeois class support. There were, however, threats to ruling class concordance. Despite the ruling class's agreement, Colorado rule would be threatened from time to time, for example by the failed Tricolor Revolution in 1875, later by the Revolution of the Quebracho in 1886, then the Colorado push to reduce Blanco power to the big 3 Latifundista-ruled departments, and the fight back of 1897, and the Blancos lost. The big 3 departments were divided up into 16 lesser gerrymandered departments, out of which the Blancos now had only control of 6. However, as a consolation prize, the Blancos were permanently assigned 1/3 of the seats in Congress, and this division of power lasted until the president, Jose Bache, instituted his political reforms at the turn of the century. These brought about the last Blanco uprising by Blancos in 1904 and ended with the Battle of Masoyer and the death of Blanco leader Aparicio Saravia. Now, the power sharing agreement of 1862 had split the Colorados into 2 factions. One, those who in principle, and they were called therefore the Principistas, were open to cooperation with Blancos, and 2, those Netos, who were against cooperation with Blancos under any circumstances. In the 1873 presidential election, the Netos supported the election of Jose Eugenio Ayari. Ayari had no base, was a virtual unknown, and was a surprise candidate. And this led to rioting in Montevideo between these 2 Colorado factions and a military coup on January 15, 1875. Ayari was exiled, and the NATO representative Pedro Varela assumed the presidency. Then in May of 1875, the Principistas began the Tricolor Revolution, and this revolution was defeated in late 1875 by an unexpected coalition headed by Blanco leader Aparicio Saravia and the Uruguayan army under the command of Lorenzo Latorre. Now, in summary, between 1875 and 1890, the military, having the guns, held political power. Colonels Latorre, Santos, and Tajes controlled the presidency, and this period lasted through the presidencies of Pedro Varela, Lorenzo Latorre, Francisco Antonino Vidal, Maximo Santos, Francisco Antonino Vidal, Maximo Santos, and finally Maximo Tajes. I give in your book the dates of all of those, but the important thing is that the political power was held by the military, because the Blancos and the Colorados never could get it together. What was happening is you had a final shift in power from the countryside to the city between the different kinds of ruling families that existed there, and well, at any rate, we'll go over that to a little degree as we go along. In 1876, Colonel Lorenzo Latorre overthrew the government of President Pedro Varela and established a strong executive presidency. The financial situation stabilized, and exports of Hereford beef and merino wool increased. Now this is the key, of course, to prosperity there, except to the degree that other things are being manufactured in Montevideo. But to export all of this beef and wool, well, the wool, of course, is one thing, but if you're going to export the beef, it's got to go through the canning factories in Montevideo, so it's supporting, you can see where you could have a foot in both camps. Father Bentos had a corned beef production factory based on indentured European labor, and it prospered. The power of regional caudillos, if they were Blancos, was phased out, and a modern governing apparatus based on New York and Chicago-style ward bossism replaced them. What this is, of course, is well, you're not going to have any kind of hereditary bosses out here. You're going to have guys that can control their neighborhoods and produce the vote when they're called upon to do it, and in exchange they control their neighborhoods by saying that the workers that live there and their families receive things that they need when they need them. President Latorre was followed by President Maximo Santos. Pirate rebels from Argentina invaded on the 28th of March in 1886, aiming to toss him out and seize power. Now this adventurism was looked down upon by the big cap powers that were, and quickly ended by Maximo Tajes. Tajes saw little difference between anarchist and syndicalist troublemakers and petty bourgeois insurgents and shot them down. Then on August 17, 1886, there was an assassination attempt against President Santos, who was shot in the jaw, and this near-death experience taught him that the better part of valor would be resignation, and he did so on November 18th of 1886, and taking over from him was Maximo Tajes, who was then selected by the army to become president, and his presidency lasted from 1886 until 1890. Under Army-Navy rule, the government was directed to modernize the country. And by this, the military chiefs meant encouraging the capitalist economic system and bourgeois social transformation. Incipient fascism, in the form of rule by businessmen and industrialists in alliance with latifundistas, was the order of the day, and no doubt the success of this system was reflected in Europe, especially in Italy, where young socialist Benito Mussolini was just learning his trade in inventing the corporatist ideology. This guy Bache I want you to remember, because he turns out to be the ideological father of Juan Perón in Argentina. Now, you'll keep that in mind now. After the Guerra Grande, the Great War, there was a steady increase in the number of immigrants. And as we have seen, this was because wages were so high in Uruguay compared to Italy and Spain. Encouraged to immigrate to Uruguay by its capitalist rulers, there was soon a large Italian, Uruguayan, and Spanish Uruguayan community. And within a few decades, the population of Uruguay doubled, and Montevideo's tripled. The number of immigrants rose from 48% of the population in 1860 to 68% in 1868, and in the 1870s a further 100,000 Europeans arrived. By 1879, about 438,000 people were living in Uruguay, a quarter of them in Montevideo, and due to immigration, Uruguay's population reached 1 million by 1900. Now, between 1860 and 1868, in other words, just in 8 years, the number of sheep herded rose from 3 million to 17 million. Large numbers of European immigrants, especially from the Basque provinces of Spain, joined the agricaps to make this possible, and much the same increase in cattle grazing fed the meat-packing factories of Montevideo, providing employment without end, it seemed. And in 1860, a canal system was initiated in Uruguay to get the meat on the hoof from the hinterlands to the slaughter in Montevideo, and for the same reason, rail links were built between the capital and the countryside. The Italians set up their Italian Chamber of Commerce in Montevideo in 1857, and the first bank opened after having become essential to facilitate agribusiness and handle the income of Montevideo's proletariat, then on saving and sending money back home to Italy. Uruguay's first telegraph line was completed, and it played a strategic role, not only in communications within Montevideo and the countryside, but especially in trade and communication with Italy. A true middle income class was coming into existence for the first time in this part of Latin America. Montevideo was the major economic center of the region thanks to its natural harbor. Its industrialization made it the commercial center for the export and import of goods from Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. The towns of Paysandú and Salvo on the Uruguay River took up whatever slack there was in the traffic over commerce in Montevideo, and it was inevitable that the richest families would try and take over commerce via banking, as they always did in every emerging capitalist country, especially in those countries with industrial cities and large agricultural rural populations, which of course happened in the U.S. too. There was an immediate struggle for and against a central bank, a national bank, in this country, you may recall. Accordingly, in 1896, the official national bank, Banco de la República, was established. Now, the dawn of the 20th century, from 1903 to 1933, are the key years that you want to take a look at if you're interested in the emergence of communism in Uruguay, which of course is the subject of our lecture, of our book, and of our course. José Bache was president from 1903 to 1907, and again from 1911 to 1915. He was the political equivalent of England's liberals, and he set the pattern for Uruguay's modern political development. He and his Colorado parties dominated the political scene until his death in 1929. They were opposed to the co-participation agreement with the Colorados and the Blancos that we discussed before. And they wanted them contained, that is, these guys were Colorados, they wanted the Blancos contained to their fraction in Congress. And led by Bache, they considered division of the departments among the parties undemocratic and most importantly unnecessary. And of course the Blancos knew what power they would lose if winner-take-all elections was introduced in all the cities and departments. Thus their last revolt in 1904. From the beginning it was doomed to failure and ended with a Colorado victory at the Battle of Mazoyer. This was the end of the old and the final triumph of the new in terms of feudal versus capitalist orders. Now, in reality, the concentration of factory and shop workers was in Montevideo. Small enterprises outnumbered large ones until the First World War. Accordingly, mass unionization of workers, as was occurring in neighboring Argentina and Brazil, was late in coming to Uruguay. Furthermore, in Uruguay, it was the government encouraging industrialization that led to government enterprises and organizations as the nation's largest employer. Naturally, this led to the government playing a central role in labor policy. Labor legislation was government-sponsored and thus established, and the established co-opted private sector labor policies pretty much had to go along the way, and this go along the way with them, and this preempted organized labor, as workers did not see any immediate need for unionization, and Uruguay's laborers, like the economy as a whole, made great strides during the decades of the 1900s, the early decades. Ironically, this progress slowed the growth of the unionized labor movement. Now, down in Argentina, we have young Juan Perón just growing up in these first decades. And by 1843, he's become a colonel in the Argentine army. And what differs what makes him different from the others in the Argentine Military United Officers Group that seized power in that 1943 coup, is that he has been watching this guy Batlle and the kind of program that he had successfully introduced that had guaranteed social peace in Uruguay for all these years. and Perón has decided that he's going to be an Argentinian Batlle. And all of this you'll see reflected in that movie Evita. If you haven't seen it, you want to go back and take a look at it. Now, in practice, President Batlle, who firmly supported the working class and the right to strike, was an important figure for laborers. His ideology, known in Uruguay as machismo, stood out in sharp contrast to the vicious anti-worker ideology that labor confronted in other South American nations. Like the Mexican PRI, Batlle's party wanted to include the workers and their unions in governing the nation. The Batlle's government created the Office of Labor and ensured that the urban working class kept a larger share of the value they created via the increasing livestock export earnings, so that by 1930, Batlle had passed legislation limiting the work week to 6 days and the workday itself to 8 hours. He and his Colorado party established a minimum wage and workmen's compensation benefits to be paid to injured workers, with Social Security benefits for retired workers. Consequently, workers felt less need for union protection. In 1926, for example, only 6,000 out of the 65,000 industrial workers were dues-paying union members. This progressivism reflected the bourgeoisie's fear of the rise of the Communist Party of Uruguay, formed in 1920. Now, you'll recall we talked about how Lenin sent Michael Baronin back to Chicago in 1919 to clean up that mess in Chicago, where you had two competing communist parties, and then had told him to go to Mexico and set up the Communist Party there and to give them the responsibility for organizing the rest of Latin America, which he did at the end of 1919. Did both of those things, and then he left the country at the very end of December, returning to Europe, and he stopped in Cuba long enough to kick off the Communist Party of Cuba, which only took him 6 hours, but the ramifications continue to this very day, again, the 26th of July, which begins the modern period of Cuban communism. Now, you'll also remember that word about the Third International being formed around Lenin's 21 points reached Uruguay virtually at the same time he was speaking in Moscow in 1919 because of the transatlantic telegraph. And we mentioned before about the telegraph had been set up about 30 years earlier in Uruguay. Now, accordingly, Uruguayan Marxists jumped the gun, forming their own Communist Party in 1920, even before Baronin's men got to Montevideo. So, from that moment forward, the bourgeoisie, who of course were well informed about what was going on in the world, had the living shit scared out of them by what was happening in the Russian Revolution, the way the First World War had ended, and so Batlle's pitch to them was, we got to get ahead of this whole thing. We'll make our workers happy to have their jobs and be sure that they get the and all it's going to do is require that we kick over a little bit more of the value to them that they are creating rather than taking it all. That way we can avoid what happened to the Tsar and his allies. So, at any rate, the emerging triumphant capitalist order introduced widespread political, social, and economic reforms. This was the Uruguayan bourgeoisie's alarmed response to the arrival of Leninism. And these reforms were aimed at making capitalism Uruguayan-style work more efficiently. This was the continuation of the far-seeing vision of Batlle that had begun years before the Bolshevik Revolution. Something that we North Americans still are going to have to learn about. You can see that these liberals in the Democratic Party never learned. First they selected this guy Obama, and he turned out to be a fascist thug. And then they want to put an even worse one in the White House, this Clinton. And and her way was paid for by this right-wing socialist, so-called, no different than Sam Gompers or Norman Thomas from Vermont. So, at any rate, maybe someday they'll wake up, maybe they won't. Along the way, the old Constitution had been replaced with a new one based on universal male suffrage. This incipient early parentism featured the nationalization of imperialist companies from North America and Europe, a social security system for the aging population, and workmen's compensation cut short the attraction of anarchism and Bolshevism, as had the introduction of unemployment benefits on the eve of the Great War in 1914. Under Batlle and the new Constitution, the Uruguayan electorate increased from 46,000 to 188,000. Income tax for lower-income proletarians and pensioners had been abolished in 1905. Secondary schools were established in every city in 1906. The right of divorce given to women in 1907. The telephone system nationalized in 1915. The 8-hour working day introduced in 1915. And to further ensure the stability of the labor force, now more desperately needed than ever before, to keep up with the demands of the World War for meatpacking. Uruguay became a secular republic in 1917, and this put a death blow to the Catholic Church estates of cattle and sheep engaged in unfair competition. That is, from the standpoint of the big agribusiness families, it was unfair competition. Now, to prevent presidential dictatorship, Batlle proposed a there it goes. Okay. Batlle proposed a collective presidency, or colegiado, based on the Swiss Federal Council model. His idea was approved by referendum on the 25th of November 1917, and a new constitution embodied the concept. Under the new constitution, a split executive was created, where the president continued to control ministries of foreign affairs, interior, and defense. Now, you'll notice here that the October Revolution, which is November 7th on his calendar, had only occurred 2 weeks before. So you can imagine that these bosses of the wealthiest families are shaking in their boots, because all of this coming across the telegraph, they know they've got native Marxists who are going to become Leninists, and they see Batlle all of a sudden as their only hope. So when he said, "I want to change the whole structure of the government," 2 weeks after the October Revolution in Russia, they said, "Okay, go ahead, do whatever you got to do, I don't care." And so they set up a new 9-man National Council of Administration, which consisted of 6 Colorados, 3 Blancos, who controlled ministries of education, finance, economy, and health. His idea for the whole thing was approved on a referendum on the 25th of November of that year, and a new constitution embodied the whole thing with a split executive, with one controlling the ministries of foreign affairs, interior, and defense, and the new 9-man council of administration for education, finances, economy, and health. So, by 1900, Uruguay had, in summary, the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. This, because of its prosperous economy and progressive government, had created a very healthy population. And in 1930, Uruguay hosted the first FIFA World Cup, that's a soccer thing, and demonstrated that although a small country, it had a very healthy athletic population. And then the home team won over Argentina. Much larger country, which should have statistically more athletes of a high quality nature, but Uruguay had the most healthy athletes, and well, anyway, I guess that speaks for itself. The coup of 1933, brought about by the Great Depression, brought fascism to Uruguay, as it did to much of Europe. President Gabriel Terra assumed dictatorial powers in a military coup in March 1933, and he took the collective leadership model, or he blamed the collective leadership model, and got support from Blanco leader Luis Alberto de Herrera. He suspended the Congress, abolished the collective executive, established a fascist dictatorship with its own constitution in 1934. In 1938, he was succeeded by his political follower and brother-in-law, General Alfredo Baldomir, and during this time the military retained large control over the nation's economy and commerce while pursuing liberal capitalist philosophy policies. Liberalism in economics being the forerunner of today's neoliberalism. At any rate, political freedom began to be restored after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad became final in 1943. On December 13, 1939, the Battle of the River Plate was fought off the coast of Uruguay, and this was the beginning of the effects of World War II on Uruguay. It was fought between British forces and the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. After a 72-hour layover in Port of Montevideo, the captain of the Graf Spee, believing the British hopelessly outnumbered him, ordered his ship scuttled. Most of the surviving crew of 1,150 were interned in Uruguay and Argentina, and many of these crewmen remained in these countries until after the war. I guess they could probably have that near-death experience convinced them that it would be better just to sit the thing out. And they were, of course, at a pretty nice place to do it. Early in 1940, the Nazi government sold salvaging rights to that vessel that they'd scuttled, to an Uruguayan businessman who acted on behalf of the British government. However, any salvaging rights would have expired under Uruguayan law. So that in 1940, Germany threatened to break off diplomatic relations with Uruguay. Germany claimed Uruguay had given safe harbor to the HMS Carnarvon Castle after it was attacked by a Nazi raider, and the ship was repaired with steel plate reportedly salvaged from the Graf Spee. After Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 41 and the U.S. entry into the Second World War on January 25th, 42, Uruguay broke diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany. So did 21 other American nations except for Argentina. With the overthrow of the Argentine government in 1943 by the fascist United Officers of Argentina, would, when they saw that their cause was lost in Europe, break relations too. However, Uruguay did not participate in any of the actual fighting. In 1945, Uruguay joined the Declaration of the United Nations. Now, Uruguay reached the peak of its economic prosperity thanks to World War II and then the Korean War. This was when Uruguay reached the highest per capita income in Latin America because of supplying beef, wool, and leather to the Allied armies in both conflicts. And remember that this beef has to be packed, and so you're talking about factories that do the canning. In 1946, a Valle loyalist, Tomás Berreta, was elected president of Uruguay, and after his sudden death, Valle's nephew, Luis Valle Beres, became president. And then to cover the British debt for the beef deliveries during World War II that they could not pay for, in 1949, British-owned railroads and water companies were nationalized. Valle's followers within the Colorado Party gained sufficient strength to push for a constitutional referendum that adapted the new Constitution of 1952. And Uruguay then returned to the collective executive model and the National Council of Government. The end of the large military demands abroad by 1955 caused economic trouble for the country, and this was reflected in high inflation, mass unemployment, and a steep drop in the standard of living for Uruguayan workers, as the caps did what they always do and sent workers to the street. The iron law of the capitalist stage now overcame all the progress labor thought it had made in the preceding century. This led to student and working class resistance, armed resistance. The government's collective ruling council was deadlocked on implementing the harsh police crackdown required to stabilize this capitalist economy in crisis. And at first the government tried spending Uruguay's currency reserves. And when that failed and was insufficient, they took on U.S. foreign loans. The Uruguayan peso devalued accordingly and inflation reached 60%. Government employees, both in government agencies and in state enterprises, constituted the largest group of salaried workers in the country. Thus their right to strike was a question of the political day. The government's civil service wage policy set the tone for wages overall. The government also participated directly in setting private sector wage policy along with unions and owners, although through this tripartite advisory boards or wage councils that had been established in the 1940s. So it was difficult for workers to act independently under these circumstances. There was, however, at any rate, a 1952 strike in the petroleum refinery that forced the government to make concessions to the oil workers' union. Government employees, both in government agencies and state agencies, constituted the largest group of salaried workers in the country. Thus, their right to strike was a pretty important political factor. The inevitable confrontation between the Communist Party and the military government is the next topic I take up here in this particular chapter. The Communist Party of Uruguay had taken command of the unions and all progressive forces after the success of in 1959 of the Cuban Revolution. Union objectives were as much political as they were economic. The government would not tolerate labor's leftist political program. A confrontation between that government and labor became inevitable in 1965 because the capitalists could not fulfill the union's wage demands by 1965 at all. So their government imposed a wage and price freeze, and as usual in these situations, in reality, only the wages were frozen. Then the government abolished the wage councils in June of '68. Strikes and strike breaking protected by the policemen became the norm. The confrontation reached its climax in 1973 when the major labor union, the National Convention of Workers, or CNT, organized a general strike to protest the military coup. The strike was the labor movement's last stand, and it dissolved under police attack within 2 weeks. The military regime that seized power in '73 now outlawed the CNT and arrested its leaders. Union activity ceased for almost 10 years. 12,000 public sector workers and at least 5,000 private sector workers were dismissed. Now, Uruguay goes under the U.S.-style right to work. Workers began to fight back against speed up and the lack of collective bargaining rights they had had for so much of the early part of the century. Sabotage was becoming widespread. Therefore, the military dictatorship allowed unions to resurface in 1981 under gringo-style right-to-work conditions. Unions would have to qualify with military inspectors. A secret ballot was to be used for collective bargaining, for election of leadership, and for strike votes. Leaders of previously outlawed organizations were ordered not to engage in political activity, meaning not to belong to the outlawed Communist Party of Uruguay or be accused of furthering its aims. As the economy continued depressed anyway, because of the 1981 to 1984 recession, union activity was minimal. However, workers had gotten used to underground organizing. Restoration of civilian government by 1985 was inevitable, and successful general strikes before and after the election of President Sanguinetti made it essential to move away from CIA-imposed fascism. The dictatorship set up the framework for government-labor relations during the 1984-1985 period, officially called the National Conciliatory Program. I'm skipping the Spanish names. Now, the Communist Party demanded through its labor unions that the incoming government adopt a three-part policy toward labor, namely, 1, the repeal of the legislation that restricted union activity and collective bargaining, the reinstatement of all public sector employees who had been dismissed by the military regime for their union activity, the restoration of workers' purchasing power, and periodic wage increases. The new government quickly complied with the first two recommendations, but the third became a fighting issue. The CIA established fascism in Uruguay, and the guerrillas fought back. The Blancos won the 1958 elections. As the ruling party in the council, the Blancos sought the return of the fascist dictatorship. They got it via a referendum and a new constitution in '67. However, the price they had to pay for the election of 1967 was the return of the Colorados' power. This time the Colorados showed their true class loyalty and adopted fascism as their own. The US CIA encouraged this and encouraged the Colorados to follow its formula for creating fascism in Latin America, but growing popular resistance led to the armed Tupamaros guerrilla insurgency. The Tupamaros guerrilla army was an urban guerrilla movement known as the Tupamaros and had formed in the early 1960s. At first it robbed banks, Robin Hood style, distributing food and money in poor neighborhoods. Then it supplemented this revenue stream with political kidnappings, and as the revolution got bigger, it began attacks on the army outright and the secret police. The revolutionaries began to show the real power they had, and the big capitalists realized that a Cuban style of revolution might in fact overthrow them. They opted to bring in the gringo CIA and establish a Hitlerian system, and the mechanism was called OPS, or OPS. In 1965, the U.S. Office of Public Safety began operating in Uruguay. The U.S. OPS trained Uruguayan police and intelligence in policing and interrogation techniques, and of course it was run by the CIA. One-time chief of the Uruguayan police intelligence, Alejandro Otero, told a Brazilian newspaper in 1970 that the U.S. introduced modern torture techniques. The gringo boss of OPS in Uruguay was named Dan Mitrione, and he personally instructed the Uruguayan police on how to torture suspects with electrical implements, which was his specialty. The CIA's dictatorship lasted from 1973 to 1985. The first phase of the CIA plan featured President Jorge Pacheco declaring a state of emergency in 1968. The second stage of the CIA regime began in 1972 with the elimination of all civil liberties by Pacheco's successor as president, the cattle magnate Juan Maria Bordaberry. Bordaberry first used the army to combat the guerrillas of the Movement of National Liberation, MLN, which was a separate guerrilla organization from the Tupamaros. Then he went after the Tupamaros. Neither force was defeated. Both went underground and into the mountains and plains. As usual, the CIA saw to it that that torture was used to gather information needed to break up the MLN and the Tupamaros. Now, readers of this textbook know by now that state torture, practice taught by the CIA, would eventually soon be used against trade union officers, members of the Communist Party, and eventually any and every regular citizen would be suspected of anti-fascist sympathies, or just for extortion. And after all, once they have this practice established, you could arrest anybody and shake them down for money. Anyhow, and of course that happened all the time. Uruguay soon had the highest per capita percentage of political prisoners in the world. The MLN heads were isolated in improvised prisons and subjected to repeated acts of torture. Emigration from Uruguay rose drastically as large numbers of Uruguayans looked for political asylum throughout the world. In fact, torture practices continued to the end of the CIA's Uruguayan dictatorship in 1985. Still, the army and police were on the back foot as the rebels blew the shit out of them. Bordaberry was finally removed as president in 1976 and succeeded by Alberto de Michele, subsequently a national council chosen by the government-selected Aparicio Mendes. In 1980, in order to legitimize their position, the armed forces proposed a change to the Constitution to be ratified by referendum. In the event, only 40% of the electorate approved of the fascist regime's proposed new constitution, and the army wanted to find this a convenient excuse to leave office voluntarily. However, before the extant economic crisis brought about a Cuban revolution full frame, things went from bad to worse, and the generals had to delay transition to a civilian government, and in 1981, General Gregorio Alvarez assumed the presidency. In 1984, massive protests against the dictatorship threatened to bring down any cap government. Then, after a 24-general strike, talks between civilian capitalists and the armed forces produced a plan for a return to civilian rule, and national elections were held later in 1984. and they were won by the Colorado Party leader Julio Maria Sanguinetti, and he became the president serving from 85 to 90. The first Sanguinetti administration implemented minimal economic reforms demanded by the populace. His economic policy opened the economy to U.S. capital and U.S. corporations in foreign trade. Sanguinetti refused to prosecute the military officials who had engaged in the repression and torture either against the Tupamaros or the MLN, and instead he opted for signing the law of amnesty, which allowed these criminals to walk scot-free. He did agree, however, to release imprisoned guerrilla leaders eventually, and thousands of Uruguayans are known to have been killed during the CIA's 12-year military rule that went on from 73 to 85. Most were killed in Argentina and other neighboring countries. A large number of those killed have never been found, and these missing people are referred to as desaparecidos, or disappeared. In 1989, the National Party's Luis Alberto Lacalle won the presidential election. He served from 90 to 95. President Lacalle executed major economic structural reforms featuring Uruguay's inclusion in the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, in 1991. Now, despite economic growth, during Lacalle's term, neoliberal programming and privatization efforts provoked political opposition. Some so-called reforms were overturned by referendum, and in March 85, Sanguinetti abrogated laws and decrees issued by the military regime that had banned the labor unions, the immunity of labor union leaders, and the right of public and private workers to strike, and he also restored the legal status of the primarily communist-led National Convention of Workers, CNT, that had been dissolved by the Army in 1973. In 1983, the PIT, Inter-Union Workers Assembly or Plenum, adopted the name PIT-CNT, to show its link with the banned CNT. And in the press now, if you go to Telesur and look on their Uruguayan page, you'll see that there's ongoing strike activity between PIT, CNT, and a variety of capitalists for a whole bunch of reasons. At any rate, the long outlawed labor movement took advantage of its newly granted freedom by staging strikes and marches. In 1986, Sanguinetti's government and the Colorado Party signed a non-aggression pact with the Communist Party of Uruguay. Under the Colorado Communist Pact, the COCO Pact, militant labor members of the Colorado Party and the PCU formed alliances whenever the National Party promoted a movement within a labor organization, and nevertheless the powerful main labor organization PIT-CNT staged 3 general strikes in '86. The communist-led Uruguayan labor movement represented about 300,000 of the 1.3 million Uruguayan workers, and it called general strikes in the late 1980s, as well as strikes in specific job areas mostly involving civil service workers or those in state enterprises. The attitudes of the leadership of the Moscow-oriented World Federation of Trade Unions, WFTU, to the PIT-CNT was affiliated, but they were among the main issues discussed by candidates in the 1989 presidential campaign. CAP candidates endorsed proposals for legislation to require the secret strike votes and other union regulation. The WFTU supported the PCU and other leftist political groups united in the Broad Front. However, developments in the Soviet Union brought about a great deal of confusion within the communist movement in Uruguay, as they did worldwide. In November 1989, the Broad Front was preparing for a showdown with the mainstream political leaders over whether or not to espouse the U.S. demanded neoliberal opening of the economy to U.S. banks and corporations. Although the PIT-CNT's leadership opposed increasing foreign investment, those influenced by the great trader Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika restructuring in the Soviet Union were fractionalizing the organization. Accordingly, the PCU divided between modern revisionist traders and revolutionaries. Lacalle advocated regulating labor union activities, including the right to strike. In his view, the decision on whether or not to strike should be made by the workers in a secret vote after the failure of obligatory reconciliation efforts. Shortly after Lacalle took office, Minister of Labor and Social Welfare Carlos Cat, who ran for mayor of Montevideo in the '89 elections, met with representatives of business organizations and the Pit C&T, but failed to reach an agreement. The Pit C&T demonstrated its right to strike with a 6-hour general work stoppage on July 25, 1990, to protest the government's austerity and privatization programs. Despite Lacalle's efforts to regulate the sector, Uruguay's labor movement in 1990 still had significant clout as an interest group, mainly with regard to highly disruptive strike tactics, leftist political organizations, and the labor unions' continued use of the same rhetoric and methods that had gotten them results against the military government. In 1994 elections, the former President Sanguinetti won a new term, which ran until March of 2000. As no single party had a majority in the General Assembly, the National Party joined with Sanguinetti's Colorado Party in a coalition government, and the Sanguinetti government continued the neoliberal policies insisted upon by Gringolandia, and on the progressive side pursued integration into Mercosur. There was improvement in the social security system, public education, and cops came under civilian supervision. The economy grew steadily for most of Sanguinetti's term until low commodity prices and economic difficulties in its main export markets caused the 1999 to 2002 cyclical capitalist recession depression. The 1999 elections featured primaries in April and a general election in October, and these determined the makeup of the national legislature, and for president, a runoff was held in November between Colorado Party candidate Jorge Valle, and who defeated Broad Front candidate Tabaré Vázquez. The Colorado and national parties continued their legislative coalition, as neither party by itself won as many seats as the 40% of each house won by the Broad Front coalition. So, the formal coalition ended in November 2002 when the Blancos withdrew their ministers from the cabinet. All the Blancos continued to support the Colorado on most issues in Congress. Valle's 5-year term was marked by economic recession. In 1999, there was a devaluation again of the Brazilian real. Naturally, this affected Uruguay almost as much as Brazil. In 2001, there was an outbreak of aftosa, that is foot-and-mouth disease, in Uruguay, and that dealt a severe blow to the meatpacking industry. Then the collapse of government and economy in Argentina finished off any hopes in Uruguay of a return to old-fashioned Valleism, as the percentage of Uruguayans in poverty reached almost 40%. Now, neoliberalism imposed by the U.S. was rejected by the mass of Uruguayans. Attempts by capitalists from abroad to take over the government petroleum company and the government water company in 2003 and 2004 were the final tolling of the bell. Consequently, in 2004, Uruguayans elected Tabaré Vázquez as president, and the Broad Coalition won a majority in both houses of Parliament. So for the first time in its history, Uruguay has a true left government. Then in 2009, former Tupamaro and Agriculture Minister Jose Mojica was elected president and succeeded Vázquez on March 1st, 2010, just 6 years ago. Now, he has subsequently been replaced by another man from his own party, but it doesn't seem to have changed the policies of the government, which have been real good under both Vázquez and Mojica. Now, there's just one more thing I was going to mention. If you go to the Uruguay page on Telesur, they have got lots of information about what's going on in the day-to-day in the last few weeks. There's strikes going on, this, that, and the other. I think the most important development that is going to affect Uruguay, it was announced on Prensa Latina on the 22nd of July this year, just a few days ago, and that is that the Bank of Palestine announced that it's creating a strong link with its Palestinian diaspora in Latin America in order to involve them in the development of the Palestinian nation. Now, the Bank of Palestine will become the first Arab bank in Latin America when it opens its branch office in Santiago next year, and it's now looking for opportunities in Honduras, a country with more than 250,000 Palestinian descendants. Now, Bank President Hashim Shawa said the main goal of this expansion is to create a strong link with the Palestinian diaspora. In Chile, there are more than 500,000 Palestinian descendants, so it made sense for them to open a branch first in Santiago. Now, that's the largest Palestinian community outside the Middle East, 500,000 in Chile. The services offered in Latin America are the normal ones of an investment bank with the possibility of investing in Palestine in property stock purchases. And now, so I looked to see how many Palestinians there are in Uruguay, and it turns out that there's about 500. And mostly they live on the Brazilian border and in the town of Chuy, where they run their own association, and the next biggest place they occupy is a little town called Rivera. Well, this is only interesting because whenever you have a bank like this opening that's based upon having nationals in some place in another country, you want to take a look at just, well, who are these people? Among those 500, which isn't very many, you can bet that there'll be a few who are businessmen, small businessmen at least, of some kind, and they will, of course, turn to this bank if they can for support. So we'll just see what happens in that regard. At any rate, you can see that Uruguay has this constant history, and you always want to look at it from the standpoint of class analysis, as class struggle, which I've tried to do as we present this. And so at that point, that concludes chapter 63, lecture 46. We have one more lecture left in this series for the 2017 version of the book. That'll be lectures 47 on the Empire Strikes Back against Paraguay, and that's going to wrap that up. And now I have a plan for a set of lectures after that on archaeology, which some of you will be interested in, but I won't. First of all, I haven't thought that out fully, so I'm not ready to announce it. But this is going to wrap up the ABCs of Communism lectures in this series for the time being. And depending upon political events, we'll decide whether we're going to add any more this year or not in this particular series. So with that comment, I'll see you just one more time in this series, and that'll be to go over chapter 64, lecture 47 on the Empire Strikes Back against Paraguay.